Hey YouTube, Brandon Ascari here with another awesome and insightful episode of Ascari Digital's Content Creator Academy, where, as you know, it is my goal to help educate and inspire you to being the best filmmaker that you could be. This week we're just going to skip the intro because why not? Live dangerously. But anyway, this week we're going to be talking about tips for handheld shooting. Why? Because there's a lot of handheld shots out there and some of them, not so great. But let's make them better, why don't we? So when thinking about handheld shooting, there's a couple things to keep in mind. First, what camera are you using? It's actually really important because some cameras have in-body image stabilization, also known as IBIS, I-B-I-S. So if you're out shopping for a camera, it may be a good time to take a look and see if the camera that you're buying has IBIS, because that could be an important determining factor for you in what camera you buy, especially if you know that you're going to be doing some handheld shooting. Believe it or not, iPhones actually have pretty good image stabilization built into the phone. It's actually kind of surprising how good it is, especially if you use some practices to help smooth out your movement. Another thing that you'll want to look for on a camera, if you have the option to purchase a lens that has image stabilization, IS, built into it, then that's another great combination, especially if you pair the two of them together. It's basically like a gimbal in your hand, which is amazing. So those are some things to look out for in regards to cameras and lenses. Usually the medium tier cameras don't always have it, especially in Sony's, and a lot of Canons and Panasonics, I believe they have in-body image stabilization, even on their Micro Four Thirds and Super 35 cameras. Definitely check that, whichever camera you're looking at. I know my Sony a6400 does not have it, but that's why I have a gimbal for it, so that helps out. The next tip for shooting handheld is actually going to be in camera settings. Yes, there is some stuff you could do with camera settings to help your handheld footage. One of those things is actually shooting at a higher frame rate. So let's say, for instance, you're shooting at 23.98 or 24 frames per second. Well, if you shoot at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, it actually does help to smooth out the movement a little bit. And then it also gives you the option, especially if it's a B-roll or cutaway shot, to slow it down if you plan on releasing at 24 frames per second, because slow motion helps smooth out the shots, also because you could take a smaller snippet of it now that it's longer. So utilizing those camera techniques in your settings can actually help with the smoothness of your handheld footage. Another thing that you actually have to keep in mind with that, believe it or not, is your shutter speed, because as we've talked about in previous episodes, your shutter speed is supposed to be 2 times what your frame rate is on average for normal motion blur. So if we've increased our frames per second that we're filming in up to 120, then we need to now change our shutter speed up to 1/240th of a second. Same thing if we went from 24 frames per second to 60 frames per second. Now our shutter speed would be 1/120th of a second. So that way we get the motion blur that's normal to the eye, unless you're going for a desired effect. Otherwise, I highly recommend you check out the episode on camera settings that I've done, because we go more into detail about how we register motion blur to our eye, what we're used to, and what changing it, making it faster or slower has to do. So very important when it comes to changing your camera settings. You always want to remember that some other settings are going to be affected by making those changes. But just know that when you shoot at a higher frame rate, like 120 frames per second or even 60 frames per second, that you will get smoother footage out of whatever you're doing handheld. The next tip that I want to give is thinking about how long the clip is going to be, because generally speaking, when you're doing a handheld shot, you'll probably want to cut faster. You won't want to hang on a shot for 20 seconds or 30 seconds, because it's just going to be too hard to keep a smooth moving shot handheld for a long period of time. So knowing to cut a little bit sooner in the shot will help you when you're filming, because you won't have to hold the shot for as long, which is good. And you'll know not to hold for too long when you're editing, because then you may see a little bump or a jar in the camera or something like that. My next tip is going to be for actually how you operate the camera. One of the best things to do is bend your knees just a little bit, so bend them slightly. Then you're going to take your elbows and your arms and you're going to push them in like this and hold the camera. Bend the knees a little bit, like I said, and then you're going to take a deep breath and hold your breath for as long as the scene that you're filming lasts. So and I'm back. Look at that. Magic. I can hold my breath. Who would have thought? Not as long as I was hoping for. But holding your breath, bending your knees, and pushing in your elbows is one of the best ways to help smooth out footage. Even if your camera doesn't have in-body image stabilization, your lens doesn't have image stabilization, you don't have access to a camera that could shoot at really high frames per second, you know, any of those things, just one of the best things you could do just physically to help get smoother footage, bending the knees, pulling the elbows in, and holding your breath. So using all of those things together, and like I said, when you're in post, making sure that you try to cut more frequently, basically whenever you see like a little bump in the image or something like that. Now what you can do, if it still didn't come out as smooth as you would like it to when you're in post, you can use, especially in Adobe, I don't know what it's called in the other softwares, but you could use what we call warp stabilizer. Basically what that is a drag and drop effect with a couple of settings that you could tweak, and it will help smooth out your footage for you in post. Now, what it does is it actually stretches it out a little bit, and then it'll be more zoomed in, and that way it allows it to like move with the shot itself, so that way it keeps it a little smoother. So what does that mean when you're filming? Well, when you're filming, what that means is you now have to shoot a little bit wider than you were thinking about, because if you don't, then you're going to have a problem because it's going to be too tight when the warp stabilizer crops in to give you that smoother shot. So remember, if you need to rely on warp stabilizer, shoot a little wider than you were planning, maybe 10 to 20% wider, just so when it crops in, even if it has to go in a little bit more, it'll be fine. And the last tip for getting more stable footage out of your handheld would be using wider angle lenses. Believe it or not, the tighter the lens that you have, like a 50mm, 100mm, 200mm, the much shakier it's going to be because it's shooting all the way down there, as opposed to like a small 16mm lens shows this. Well, a 400mm lens is like this. So because it's that much closer, it's a heck of a lot more wobbly when you're moving around. So usually you only use like 100mm and up lenses when you're on a tripod and locked off. You wouldn't even put them on a gimbal stabilizer or something like that, usually not past a 50. But for those of you who don't know, it is good to know that you shouldn't do that. It's going to be really hard to pull off. It's going to be super, super shaky. So try to stick to like a 35mm or wider. If you absolutely have to, go to a 50mm, but I wouldn't recommend that or past. I think a 35mm or 24mm and wider is going to be your best bet as far as handheld footage goes. But again, just user discretion is advised. That's all. So all in all, those are some things that you should take into consideration when you're looking to shoot handheld videos. First of all, when you're looking at cameras to purchase, does it have IBIS, in-body image stabilization? Does it have IS on the lenses, image stabilization? Does the camera give you the option to shoot at higher frame rates like 60, 120, 240 frames per second or FPS? Your phone gives you some pretty smooth footage, but again, your phone doesn't shoot the best in the world for smooth footage, but some practices that you can use to make it even better, as well as with any other camera, is to bend your knees a little bit, pull the elbows in, and hold your breath. And then thinking about some other things that you could do to smooth out the footage in post, using the warp stabilizer. Those are all things that you can use to help make handheld video look as good as it possibly can, keep it nice and smooth, so it's almost like you have a dolly with your hands. Pretty cool. Otherwise, you would have to invest in a gimbal, a steady cam, or a glide cam, or something else that is a little bit more expensive and an extra accessory that not everybody has access to. So if you have any questions, as always, my name is Brandon Ascari from Ascari Digital's Content Creator Academy. Leave a comment down below. I'm always checking them so I can answer your questions as soon as possible. Don't forget to like the video, give us a huge thumbs up. Ow. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you and all your friends can be the first to see our videos when they air Mondays and Wednesdays. And in the meantime, as always, I will see ya!